is Sister Therese Sister Delgenio is a sister of Notre Dame Granada and is currently acting as the National Canonical Director of Novices for her community. She received her spiritual direction training at the Claret Center in Chicago, Illinois. For 12 years, she was a pastoral associate at an Illinois church where she trained parishioners to care for the needs of the materially poor and to act as interventionists for individuals and families with addiction problems. As Director of Field Education at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, she taught and arranged ministry sites for theology students. For 17 years, she was the founder and executive director of Southwest Chicago Paths, which is a shelter and resource center for men, women, and children on the streets. If you could all join me in welcoming Sister Therese Delgenio.
Griffin started his work at Northwestern Law School in the fall of 1978. That was the Middle Ages for some of you young alums. So he was the lone student in the JD PhD program at that time. And as a result, that program then was not structured or funded like it is now. So it was up to Gene to make it up as he went along. He finished his JD in 1983 and did a clinical internship through Harvard Medical School and completed his PhD in 1987. Unfortunately, in those Middle Ages, there was no existing job for a JD PhD. So again, Gene had to make it up as he went along. He has a pretty checkered career. He has worked as an attorney and a clinical psychologist. He's worked as a researcher and an administrator. And as an academic, recently retired 2 years ago from Northwestern Medical School. He's done trial work and therapy. He's designed legislation and government policies. He's taught and he's trained trainers, and he has sat on numerous committees. There is a thread that runs through Gene's last 30 years of service, and that thread is that he has cared about and worked for the poor, whether they were children or people in need in any way. And occasionally, when faced with a crisis, he did what he always did well, is he made it up as he went along. And I can bear testimony to that, because I met Gene when he was a second-year law student, when I was director of St. Victor's Outreach Team in Calumet City, where I taught maybe 20 people how to be interventionists, how to educate and motivate drug addicts, alcoholics, and their families to seek treatment. One evening when we were at a team meeting, the phone rang, and we had a hysterical parishioner on the phone who was alarmed that her alcoholic brother Jack had lost his job that day. She was sure he was drinking because all her attempts to reach him had failed, and she was afraid that he might be suicidal. And no, she didn't want to call the police yet. But would somebody go check on him? So Gene and I went to Jack's home, rang the doorbell incessantly. Jack did not answer the door, but his dog went bananas. We peeked through closed curtains and saw him sprawled on the couch. We weren't sure if he was alive or dead. So while I went back to ringing the doorbell, Gene reconnoitered and found a kitchen window open, crawled in, praying all the while that the dog was not a lake consumer. Don't you lawyers have a word for what we just did? He entered the house, came to the front door, and let me in. And briefly, what we did was we awakened Jack, and we challenged him to look at how alcohol was destroying his life. We encouraged him to seek available treatment. And then we asked him if we could drive him then in the middle of the night from Calumet City, 147th Street South, to Skokie Valley Community Hospital, where we left him in the care of professionals and recovering 12-step members. So in a sense, case closed, but not really. Fast forward 20 years, when Jean and I found ourselves in a funeral parlor at the wake for the brother of a mutual friend. When somebody at the wake said to us, "Somebody wants to see you over there." And you guessed it, it was Jack. And he wanted to personally thank us again for our small part in his 20 years of continuous sobriety. He was so happy to be healthy and alive. So now, fast forward to 2016 and tonight. Gene continues his wonderful work dealing with traumatized children. And again, when necessary, he is able to solve problems by making things up. And so I am happy and so proud to introduce to you Gene Gray.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Therese, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to Spiff for noticing. Thank you to Latin for still being Latin visitors. Since this is a Spiff event, I want to address my comments to the future attorneys tonight. My work has taken me all over the country into different parts of the world. So I've worked in New York City, in Alaska, I've worked in Sydney, Australia, and Johannesburg, South Africa. I've worked in Washington, D.C., all the way back to Chicago. Not surprisingly, poverty, mental illness, and trauma are problems that exist everywhere. And they have a huge impact on children. In every place I've been, the public sector struggles to decide what to do with these high-risk kids. Early in my career, I worked to connect mental health and juvenile justice, and later in my career, I worked to introduce concepts of trauma and brain development into child welfare and juvenile justice. The ongoing need for this type of work is endless. So what can you young attorneys do to help? The good news is you can jump in anywhere. There's endless need. Pick an issue, try something. The target's so big, it's hard to miss. Looking back on my own work, I would say there are three types of tasks I took on. I'll call them cases, causes, and commitments. Doing any of these will help, but they each require a different approach. Cases are time-limited and person-specific. Early in my career, I became involved in the Eric Morse case, which received national attention. Kathy Ryan and Randy Roberts may remember Eric Morse. He's a 5-year-old who was murdered when 10 and 11-year-old boys dropped him out of a public high-rise housing window. I testified as an expert in sentencing and made up an unprecedented treatment plan that the court actually adopted. Later in my career, for example, I worked with the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy in South Africa, where I made up a trauma-informed support system for those students who had left their poor villages to go study at the academy, only to get abused by one of the dorm members there. These types of cases were all challenging, but they were time-limited. Besides cases, you could also get involved in causes, where cases involve trying to help a person. Causes involve more trying to change the system. And these require a longer term. There are many public interest causes out there. Could use your support. You're only going to have time for a few. As an example, 1999, I helped make up the New Illinois Mental Health Juvenile Justice Initiative that identified seriously mental kids that were locked in detention centers and linked them to community services. This initiative has now handled over 10,000 referrals. More recently, Julie Beal volunteered me to work with MacArthur's Model for Change project. There I helped make up a curriculum to train juvenile justice staff on how to intervene with high-risk youth in a way that emphasized getting youth to calm down and learn from their mistakes, rather than using the traditional correctional approach of yelling, punishing, and isolating. MacArthur and the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention co-funded multiple training grants, and we have now trained over half the states in the country in how to use this curriculum. These are all working in different mental health and trauma-informed ways. These causes each took several years, a lot longer than the cases I had mentioned, but they produced some system-level change. So now we get to the hardest part, which would be making a commitment. Cases and causes are great things to get involved with. They're always worth trying, but some of you young attorneys may decide to go further and make a commitment to working with the poor. By this I mean directly working with the poor as your full-time job. This is not forever. I suggest to you that by working on a case, you will change the outcome for your client. Working for a cause, you will change the system. But working for a commitment, in my experience of working with the poor, will change you. As a law student, I worked with the State Appellate Defender's Office, I worked with the Legal Assistance Foundation, and as a young attorney, I worked as an assistant public defender in juvenile court. And these were places where I saw every day the impact of poverty. These were places where I realized that our justice system does treat the poor differently than those with money. Even when I could figure out what my client needed, I knew that there was a good chance there was no way they were going to get that resource in time. I was assigned a huge caseload, and despite my fine Northwestern training, I lost most of my legal areas. I was unable to help many of my clients in any meaningful way. I was forced to face my own limitations. I also learned cultural humility. No matter how hard I tried to understand the client or connect with him, I was always going to be an overeducated white man who went home every night to a safe place. Still, the frustration I was feeling was only a small taste of how frustrating the legal system can be for the poor. Yet in spite of these odds, these people managed to carry on. And they taught me a great deal about courage, determination, and self-respect. In short, by making a commitment to working with the poor, I came to see the justice system, the poor, and myself differently. So, why would you ever want to do any of it? This leads me to my final story. I spent several years as unit chief of a locked inpatient psychiatric unit inside a state hospital. It was a 14-bed co-ed unit that worked with extremely violent, self-destructive, mentally ill teenagers. These kids had a long history of failed treatment, and they would stay on our unit for a year or two. These kids had nothing. They were all poor, throwaway kids. Even on Christmas, most of these kids wouldn't have any visitors. So every year, our unit staff would pitch in our own money to buy gifts. I would go in on Christmas morning, and we'd meet in the day room and open presents for the kids. So one year, shortly before Christmas, a young man raised his hand in a community meeting, saying he had a complaint. It was nothing new for this one, right? He was angry at the world. So I called on him, and he said he had been with us the prior holiday season, and he was now upset because he knew we were going to be giving him all gifts at Christmas. But he had just found out that the kids weren't allowed to give gifts back to the staff. And he thought this was unfair and made the kids look selfish. So I explained that while I appreciated the thought, he in fact was correct. The state had rules supposed to protect kids. But I said there was a lot he could still do. I said he could thank the staff, he could write him a note. I said, try behavior. He remained dissatisfied. So at the end of the meeting, he raised his hand again. And he said, okay, well, you can't give a gift to the staff, but there are a lot of other kids out there who don't have it. So what if the kids on the unit got together and gave a gift to some other needy kid, and we wouldn't look so greedy? And I honestly wasn't expecting that. So I said, give me a little time to talk to the other staff, and we eventually made up the following plan. Each kid could contribute up to $1 of his or her own money. And anyone who contributed could vote on whether to get this child clothing or a toy. We ended up collecting $11.10, and the vote was to get the kid a toy. Next, I called Sister Therese, who at this point was running a homeless shelter. I explained what the kids wanted to do, and Therese was all over. She had a family at the shelter whose home had burned down. She bought a game for the two girls, explained where the gift came from. She took a Polaroid photo of the family holding their gift, and then Therese came to our community meeting the day after Christmas and showed the kids the photo and thanked them for their kindness. You never saw a prouder bunch of children. I put the photo up between the two payphones on the unit, and that photo stayed up for a year. It was the only thing on the bulletin board that remained clean and undefaced. It was the last thing I took down when the hospital closed. In fact, I still have the photo here. So why this story? Well, because I think it's a good example, maybe a great example, of the personal growth and change that can result from giving of yourself. Did one game solve the problems of the homeless family? No, of course not. But the kid's decision to reach out and help someone else was a huge step for these kids. Despite the incredible challenges they faced, these kids became more self-aware and sensitive to the suffering of others. They figured out that doing something for someone else, particularly someone who can't pay you back, is a true act of kindness and generosity. It helps the other person, but it also brings growth and healing to you. Therefore, young lawyer, I encourage you tonight to follow the example of those kids. Coming out of Northwestern, you have so much potential. Don't just use your law degrees to focus on yourself and your needs. Become more sensitive to the suffering of others. Use your gifts to take on these public interest cases, causes, and commitments. Do it to help the poor, the mentally ill, the traumatized, and do it to help yourself. Please. Thank you.